For the great lone land in Canada's northwest, the days of the buffalo hunt were over. By 1880, the huge herds had dwindled almost to nothing. And in the spring of 1881, change was in the wind. The Indians didn't really know about the promises or the politics or the almost futile public works that had been going on for 10 years. But now they could see, and the world could see, that at last there was a Canadian Pacific Railway Company ready to drive steel across the continent. The initials CPR had already entered the national lexicon. Here on the prairies, people would curse the railway. Sometimes they'd bless it, but most of all, they'd depend on it. Men would set their watches by its train whistles, and couples awakened by the passing of midnight cars would conceive their children to the sound of wheels on steel. The CPR would affect the lives of almost every Canadian. No other private company, with the single exception of the Hudson's Bay Company, has had such an influence on the destinies of the nation. The route was all set. It had been since 1872, when Sanford Fleming decided to take it north along the fertile belt of the valley of the Saskatchewan, not far from here at Batoche, along the well-traveled and now partly settled road of the fur traders.
Gentlemen, we're going to go south. We will cross the prairie here, go through the mountains here if we can get that way, and on to the Pacific.
With that statement, made in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the spring of 1881, the future of the Northwest was suddenly and unexpectedly altered. These were some of the key figures in that decision. George Stephen, CPR president. General Thomas Lafayette Rosser, the new chief engineer. And James Jerome Hill, the expatriate Canadian whose St. Paul Railway had brought together the men of the CPR syndicate. The new route would run right through Palliser's Triangle, that arid grassland that almost everybody dismissed as desert. Everybody, that is, but the Irish botanist John McCowan, who had just delivered a first-hand report enthusing about the farming potential of those southern plains. Even so, the CPR men must have had their doubts.
What?
There is a loss we incur. I merely point it out. Already there have been 10 years of surveys, all dedicated to the northern route. Now, if we decide to come south, we shall lose the value of that entire expenditure. A good deal of money, I should say.
That's all?
That's all, Mr. Hill.
General Rosser?
One question. This terrain we propose to cross, where are you going to find all the trees you're going to need for all the ties and trestles?
Oh, very simple, Rosser. I'm engaged in the forwarding business. We both are. We will transport whatever we need on the prairies on our railroad, and there's money in that. If we build this road across the prairie, we will carry every pound of supplies the settlers need, and we will carry every pound of produce the settlers wish to sell. We will have freight both ways. In short, we will have cornered the market. Done?
Done. The CPR would redraw the map of the Canadian prairies and determine the destinies of Westerners for decades to come. This is the kind of dry grassland that the first waves of immigrants would have to contend with, and all because of the CPR's strange decision to pull the line down south. You know, that's one of the great mysteries of our history. Why did they do that? Certainly there was the fear of American railways moving in and draining future profits from these prairies. The monopoly clause in the contract only had 20 years to run. But I think another kind of monopoly influenced the syndicate's decision. Speculators were moving into the Fertile Belt, eager to see land values escalated by the approaching railway. Now the CPR reasoned, why should we contribute to the profits of another man's land? In the race to make money from prairie land, the CPR had a definite head start. General Rosser was the man to locate the stations and thus to determine the town sites. He rode out that spring to the spot where the line would cross the Assiniboine River to have a talk with one of the pioneer residents, a man named John McVicker. And there are several versions of what happened, but all these versions agree that Rosser, on behalf of the CPR, made an offer for the land and that McVicker asked for more. The general's reply was to set the pattern for the railway's future dealings with any land speculator.
I'll be damned if a town of any kind is ever built here. Come on. Yeah.
Rosser simply moved the site of the station 2 miles west, and that's how the town of Brandon, Manitoba began. But the place to watch was Winnipeg. The railway would transform the old Fort Garry settlement into a boomtown. Where Main Street lay, Red River carts had once squeaked through the mud 12 abreast. As a result, this was the widest street in Canada, and already frontage on it cost up to $2,000 a foot. Within a year, the population would double. While the town's new horse-drawn streetcars rattled around the business section, the CPR began construction 70 miles to the west. Word reached Winnipeg that the new line would be a far cry from the flimsy construction of some government contractors. Because you see, now the railway was being built by the same men who would one day operate it, and it wouldn't pay to cut corners. But 1881 was a great disappointment to the CPR. Only 130 miles of prairie track were laid, and the word was getting out that the general manager and his chief engineer, Rosser, were themselves both involved in land speculation. The CPR badly needed a new general manager, somebody who could come in, take over, get the whole project moving. Jim Hill found just the man for that job. His name was William Cornelius Van Horn. He was an American, and he'd earned the title the ablest railway general in the world. The challenge offered him was the building of the world's most difficult railway. And that was something Van Horn could not resist. But just to make sure, the CPR agreed to pay him the largest salary ever dangled before a railwayman in the West, a princely $15,000 a year. In the fall of 1881, Van Horn was in St. Paul with Jim Hill, and it may be that he began to suspect that Hill had a few ambitions of his own. If the new general manager condemned the CPR's proposed line north of Lake Superior as impractical, then the lion's share of the western traffic could be carried by Hill on his own St. Paul Railway.
I have, as you know, some doubts about the terrain north of Lake Superior. Now that you've been there and seen it for yourself, I guess you can judge how near impossible it is? Well, I'm not saying it can't be done. But I think we have to consider very carefully the balance between what we'd gain and what we'd lose in the long run.
And what is it you think we'd lose in the long run?
What Jim Hill would lose would be the CPR. He'd resign within a year because when Van Horn met the CPR president, George Stephen, in Montreal, they were in total agreement. Stephen had lost his earlier misgivings about the Superior Line. Now he decided the railway would take a Canadian route all the way. On his way back west, Van Horn decreed that there'd be no more land speculation among CPR officials.
I quote from the St. Paul Pioneer Press of yesterday. The speaker is you. There is no foundation for the reports of my resignation. I have not resigned, nor have I formally tendered my desire to do so. The fact is, there's been a little misunderstanding.
Mr. Van Horn,
Would you excuse us just for a moment, please?
I beg your pardon.
You go on to say in that rag I just threw away that your little misunderstanding is of such a character as to be perfectly ordinary, General Rosser. I think your words are perfectly ordinary and of no interest to the public whatsoever.
That's right. Why should it be?
I think it's always of interest to the public when the chief engineer of a major railroad has been fired.
Mr. Van Horn, it's perfectly simple. I can explain.
No, you can't. To John Stewart, etc. In haste, I may reveal to you, for your privileged and private information, the future location of the terminal for the Mountain Division of the Pembina Line.
But there's nothing wrong in that.
And it's precisely because you say there's nothing wrong in it that I want your resignation.
Mr. Van Horn, you must give me time. I have surveys to complete. I have a great deal of work undone. While my assistant is even now in the field, I'm to meet him at Fort Qu'Appelle. I cannot send word to him in time to...
General Rosser, I have no intention of damaging your reputation unnecessarily, but you will please not pursue this any further. You are being let go, and I want your resignation as of today.
Get away, damn you!
Sorry. Your resignation within the hour, General Rosser. And your apology to that young man within the minute.
Now Van Horn was on his way back to his headquarters in Winnipeg, and even in those boomtown days with the streets jammed with the most incredible kind of people, Winnipeg had never seen anything quite like him. He knew a terrifying amount about railroads. In fact, he knew a terrifying amount about everything. But there was no job on a railroad that he couldn't do. He could take 800 freight cars and make them do the work of 1,000. He could doctor a sick railroad until it showed a big profit. He could comprehend the chatter of the fastest telegraph key. He could run any locomotive going. And he was a fighter. He fought the grasshoppers, he'd fought the labor unions, he'd fought rival railroads, and always he'd won. He was very much a product of his age, you know, because in those days, the railroad was king, and Van Horn was king of the railroads. He was quite simply the greatest railroad man this continent has ever seen. Van Horn was a true Renaissance man. His phenomenal interests ranged all the way from geology to oil painting. His appetite for achievement was matched only by his appetite for the best food and the best cigars and the best brandy. He was tireless. In another age, he might have been a prince of the church or a Roman conqueror. In this age, he was certainly the man to build the impossible railway. Winnipeg was to be the base of Van Horn's prairie operation. This was the little settlement that, with the railway's help, was going to try its damnedest to become the Chicago of the Canadian Northwest. Van Horn's arrival in the West had found Winnipeg in the middle of an incredible real estate boom. Everybody seemed to have gone crazy. They were buying, they were selling, they were speculating in lots, in subdivisions, in town sites. Men were making millions overnight and losing millions overnight. It was so big that the Times of London sent a man out to Winnipeg, and he reported that the little girls in the streets were playing the game, pretending to sell lots for their dolls' houses. And he said, if you see a young couple at a barn dance, engaged in passionate conversation, it's probable that they're not talking about love, they're talking about land. And then, with the Red River overflowing her banks, the boom ended with a crash. Hearts were broken, and so were pocketbooks. And Winnipeg was older and wiser. Fortunately, it didn't take the people of Winnipeg long to recover from their real estate madness, and now they got down to business again. The spring floods had delayed Van Horn's track-laying campaign, but in spite of the raging river, Winnipeg was experiencing a boom of a new kind. The railway general was marshaling his troops in true military fashion. There were armies of men pouring off the incoming trains. Contractors began to haul in every stick of timber, every fish plate, tie, rail, and spike, piling for bridges. Enough provisions and food for an army of almost 8,000 men and close to 2,000 horses, so that the little prairie town was becoming a gigantic supply depot. Railroad ties from Lake of the Woods, lumber from Minnesota, rails from England and Germany. The prairie line would be built like a telescope, reaching west from this single base. Countless trains would leave Winnipeg, all heading for the pulse of the whole operation, end of track, the point that never stayed in the same place for more than a few hours at a time. End of Track was a unique mobile community that could simply pick up and move as the line was built. The boarding cars were 3 stories high, with offices and dining rooms and kitchens below and above the dormitories for the navvies. An army of workmen recruited from just about any nationality, class, and occupation that anybody could name. Finally, the CPR was on the move. Van Horn himself was seldom in one place for long. Much of the time he did his work in transit, living in his own private car.
I think you're going to be pleased with what I have to say, Mr. Van Horn.
Which is?
While you were away in Montreal, I got together all my reports. That is, pulling in everything from right along the whole route.
The proposed route, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir, the proposed route. Anyway, I got them all together, I looked them over, and I think I can deliver you, give or take a mile or two, of course, as many as 400 miles of survey.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that means your crews are going to be kept on their toes come summer, Mr. Van Horn. What with 400 miles of railroad to build. There's a place out there called Moose Jawbone, and that's where we're headed.
I will admit I've heard of this place, Mr. Secretary. Moose Jawbone Creek, I believe is the actual name. But I think you'll find that whatever it's called, it's exactly 100 miles shy of our destination.
Are you saying that you intend to make 500 miles this season?
I am.
But all we've surveyed is 4.
Well, then, you've got a problem, haven't you, Mr. Secretary? 500 miles of track with trains running over them by fall.
Mr. Van Horn, I think what you're suggesting is impossible.
What I'm suggesting, Mr. Secretary, is what we're going to get.
Yes, sir.
Every morning, all summer long, trains set out from the nearest supply yard, each carrying the exact number of rails, spikes, fish plates, ties, and telegraph poles for precisely 1/2 mile of line. When the materials reached end of track, the navvies took over. If Van Horn's objective was to build 500 miles of track in a single season, that meant going 4 times faster than in the CPR's first year. And there was just one way to do it with military precision.
South! Forward! South! Forward! South! Forward! North! Forward! North! Forward! South a bit!
Mr. Secretary.
Yes?
What's the matter?
We have a problem. Indians.
Yes?
They're pulling up the survey stakes. The moment we put them in, up they come.
Well, what are you doing about it?
Well, I told my men to shoot on sight.
Well, that may have been a very short-sighted order, Mr. Secretary.
The CPR was on its way west under the generalship of one of the most dynamic men of the century. Records were broken, history was made, and a prairie that had lain undisturbed for centuries was suddenly transformed. All season long, the CPR pushed across the plains. One of those who watched was the missionary priest, Father Albert Lacombe.
I would look in silence at the road coming on, like a band of wild geese in the sky, cutting its way through the prairie, opening up the great country we thought would be ours for years. Like a vision, I could see it driving my poor Indians before it, and spreading out behind it the farms and the towns and the cities. No one who has not lived in the West since the old times can realize what is due to that road, that CPR.
History was being made in that quite incredible summer of 1882. But as is so often the case, those who were present were far too busy to realize it. A homesteader would leave his sod hut to spend the day on the bald prairie gathering firewood, and he'd come back at dusk to find a line of steel stretching from horizon to horizon, where no such line had stretched before. And so, as the Indians stood by, bewildered and puzzled, the rails crept across the plains, 3, 4, 5 miles a day. And always there was Van Horn. He became something of a terror. His employees began to view him as a kind of Superman who had the uncanny habit of turning up just when they least expected him or wanted him. There was an uninhibited columnist named R.K. Kerrigan. He signed himself the Dervish Khan, the Screamer of Capel. And he used to watch with wry amusement when Van Horn descended on the unsuspecting settlement at the end of track. Kerrigan wrote for the Winnipeg Sun, and he was there at the mobile community named Flat Creek.
To see Van Horn get out of the car and go softly up the platform, you'd think he was an evangelist on his way to preach temperance to the mounted police. But you're soon undeceived. Van Horn wants to know. He's that kind of man. He wants to know why this was not done and why this was done. If the answers are not satisfactory, there is a dark and bloody tragedy enacted right there. And by the time the smoke is cleared away, Van Horn has discharged all the officials and hired them over again at lower figures.
Hold! Right on! North! Hold! North! Hold! South! South! Hold it! North! Hold it! Hold it! North! Hold! South! South! Lead it! South! Lead it!
I'd like to get a steak once in a while. I think we should at least get a soft with no problem. Hey, here comes Van Horn.
The railway general became a legendary figure on the prairies, a man with gargantuan appetites and apparently superhuman powers.
Sleep, sir? No, sir, I never sleep. I don't need it. I eat all I can, drink all I can, smoke all I can. I don't give a damn about anything. Anybody got to take a card?
Yeah, I think we can find one. Yeah, that's a nice fire, right?
There was one thing missing from the prairies, and that was a new capital city for the Northwest Territories. Now, almost everybody figured the only possible spot for the capital would be here in the beautiful Capel Valley, which seemed to have everything. It had surrounding hills, it had sweet water, it had wood for fuel, it had timber, it had shade. But from the railway's point of view, it had one thing too many. The settlers were pouring in and buying up land, which everybody thought would become valuable city lots. But that's exactly what the CPR didn't want. They still intended to dictate the location of the major communities. This is what was chosen instead. No drinking water, no trees, no shelter, but also hardly any landowners to share the CPR's profits. The Newtown site had once been an Indian buffalo pound. The bleached bones would one day be shipped out for fertilizer at $7 a ton. Now they lay beside a skimpy river known as Pile of Bones, though its Indian name was more musical. I'm standing here by the Wascana River, and a lot of people would have liked to call a new capital Wascana. Kind of a pretty name. Instead, it was christened Regina, and almost everybody hated that name. They called it a sissy name. It was given to the capital by the wife of the new Governor General, the Princess Louise, and not many people liked her either because she made no secret of the fact that she was bored with Canada. The one booster that this wretched piece of prairie land had was the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories, Edgar Dewdney, who had selected the site, and by a peculiar coincidence selected it to run right through a piece of land that he and some of his friends had managed to buy. But the CPR treated Dewdney just like any other speculator. They avoided his acreage and they moved the station 2 miles away, and there was nothing that he or anybody else could do about that. So Regina grew up to be a strange, straggling little community with the post office and the railway station at one end and the mounted police barracks and the government house at the other, and with tents and shacks strung out in between across the bald prairie. But the settlement grew, and the rails reached town in August along with a carload of Eastern dignitaries to take part in Regina's christening. Alas, the champagne ceremony ignored Regina's first families. Nobody thought to invite them. It was the first example, but not the last, of Eastern indifference to the West. In September, the track layers were still driving towards the 500-mile quota. But back in Montreal, the CPR president, George Stephen, made a doleful report to the Prime Minister.
The amount of work on our roadbed is more than double what it would have been had it run along the valley. We have had to find $5 million from our resources. To enable me to make up my quote, I had to sell my Bank of Montreal stock.
Stephen's money helped to support Van Horn's incredible army, each of them earning from $2 to $2.50 a day, and a place in history. The 1882 season ended in a frenzy of activity, but Van Horn did not quite make his goal of 500 miles in a single season. The early floods and the bad weather of the spring had frustrated him. All the same, he set a remarkable record. He had driven 417 miles of steel on the main line. In addition to that, 28 miles of sidings, 18 miles already graded for the following season, and 100 miles of branch line through southern Manitoba. So in one way or another, the railway general had won his battle with time. And then the 1883 season exploded on the prairies. That was the year the first waves of immigration hit the West and the CPR. Settlers by the tens of thousands, more people than the railway could handle. The immigrants would have to learn the tricks of dry farming and face the shortages of water, fuel, and timber. For most of them, life centered on the cook stove. Some of them would live entirely on potatoes, bread, treacle, porridge, and endless rabbit stew. Van Horn and the CPR did what they could to help the newcomers get settled, but to the families crowding in on the colonist cars, the whole thing must have been a terrifying experience.
Would you like me to hold her?
Oh, no, thanks. Timothy'll do it. Timothy! They can disappear fast enough till the food's ready.
Timothy's at the back with his dad.
Timothy! Casey, will you send him down here? There, you see. Bringing him up to be a real man. That is to do nothing.
Yes, but I sympathize. After all, once we get there, it's the man that has to do it all.
Aye, them and the ox. Here, you. Take your sister.
You're worried? Is there anything I can do?
Only if you can change the face of the prairie. My husband has written that we have a great deal of land.
Has he built you a house?
Oh, yes. He says we have a house and a barn and a shed. We have a cow. And he's even promised to meet me in a buggy. I can't get over that. Even at home, we never had a buggy. Still, all that space. I can't get on, and neither have I wings to fly. Oh, build me a boat that will carry two, and both shall roll, my love and I. What a heavenly smell.
Yes.
You have a mission out there somewhere. Isn't that so, Father?
Yes. But a great way off from where the train will leave me.
And you aren't lonely once you get there?
No. I love it. To the point of sin.
Father Albert Lacombe was the most notable of all the Voyager priests, a nomadic missionary who'd spent most of his adult life among the Cree and the Blackfoot of the foothills. Now the remnants of their culture were about to be swept away by lines of steel and waves of settlement.
Okenapi.
No komanasta spomoken. No kosuk no ka. Kino ka esokpin. No kokoikpin. And
Sukape.
Soon the immigrants and the CPR discovered what the Indians knew all too well. In the dryness of late summer, the southern prairie practically became the desert that so many had called it. It's probable that the CPR's switch from the northern to a southern route delayed settlement of the Northwest by 20 years. Newcomers took up land to the north, while another problem grew, the Indians themselves. Some would not be ignored. Ironically, one of the most serious incidents concerned a chief who'd foreseen the inevitability of the railway and its resulting settlement, and who had signed a treaty and accepted a reserve, the great Crowfoot. He was known for his political skill, his charity, and his eloquence. But then, end of track reached the borders of his Blackfoot Reserve, not far from the future site of Calgary.
Up! Up high!
Nobody wanted another Custer-style massacre. Father Lacombe alerted Van Horn in the east, construction was stopped, and the priest was sent to placate Crowfoot.
Mixena picoex. Yakut seto kioai, ixacomoai, apistuchim. Sotam sesko sao. Tecumse suki tsiminiki.
Fortunately for the railway and for the government, Crowfoot was persuaded to wait. Soon the lieutenant governor himself arrived to give the Indians extra land in return for the CPR right-of-way.
I sincerely hope we're not going to be here much longer. There are too many deadlines to meet.
Well, we can't possibly make them all, Mr. Van Horn. Some of them should never have been made.
I don't accept that kind of talk, Mr. Secretary, and you ought to know better. And some bloody idiot has put a tunnel in the Bull River section. I want you to take that tunnel right back out.
Mr. Van Horn, that is a very difficult section. And if they put a tunnel there, that means there can't be any other way.
Mr. Secretary, that is a mud tunnel. Now, you know as well as I do that a mud tunnel is going to take at least a year to 18 months to build. Are we going to hold out the whole damn railroad for a year and a half while they build this thing? No, we're not. Take it out.
Mr. Van Horn, those mountains are in our way. The rivers don't all run right for us either. While we're at it, why don't we fix them too?
Now you're talking.
On July 28, 1883, with Calgary only 2 weeks away, a record was set that's never been surpassed for manual labor on a railroad. In a single day, the men built 6.38 miles of completely finished line. They used 16,000 ties. They used 2,000 rails, that's over 600 tons, 63,000 spikes. In 14 hours of work, each man on a hammer drove an average of 8,400 blows. Suddenly, where only a few months before there had been nothing but open prairie, the new towns sprang up around the new railway stations, and the map blossomed with names that had a distinctive prairie flavor. Moose Jaw, Medicine Hat, Indian Head. And the town of Calgary was born that summer in the valley of the Bow River. This was its first railway station. This is the very first building put up on the new town site. It's a log cabin built by a surveyor named McVetty. On August 27th, the CPR directors arrived in Calgary aboard Van Horn's private car. They'd come from Winnipeg at a speed averaging 35 miles an hour. And thanks to some new coal deposits found at a place called Medicine Hat, they had sometimes approached 60 miles an hour. Father Lacombe was made president of the railway for 2 hours in gratitude for his handling of Crowfoot. And it's said that Lacombe immediately voted himself 2 lifetime passes on the railway.
I've never been the president of anything before in my life. What an extraordinary sense of power.
Temporal, of course, Father.
Well, I don't know. I enjoyed it so much, I thought I might try it again sometime. You've been too good to me. Their railway passes, I fear, won't get me into heaven, but they will make my travels here on Earth a good deal easier.
You do a lot of traveling back and forth, don't you, Father?
Indeed. Such grave concerns as yours are not the best companions for a meal such as this.
No, Father. Once I discovered that I had ambition, well, it didn't take me long to realize that I wouldn't survive unless I divided my life into parts.
Work and leisure.
Oh, no, Father. Attention and undivided attention.
I understand.
Yes, I believe you do. At the moment, my attention is focused on the railroad's financial problems.
And your undivided attention?
It's out there, Father. Those mountains. They're in my way.